Hey folks, welcome to the Encuentros Latinx podcast, where we explore stories of spirituality, identity, and culture from Latinx perspectives. My name is Taylor Amaj. I'm an author and editor, and I'm Puerto Rican. This podcast is a project of Encuentros Latinx, an LGBTQ plus ministry in the United Church of Christ. You may remember La Muna from one of our previous episodes. Well, she just wrote a reflection piece for Encuentros Latinx called 5 Loaves and 2 Fish that you can now find on ucc.org. Encuentros Latinx posts monthly short reflections for spiritual contemplation, so go check them out if devotional reading is part of your spiritual practice. I've got a book recommendation for you today, Transcendent Kingdom by Yaa Gyasi. It's about a woman named Gifty who's the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants and is currently a neuroscience PhD candidate. But she comes from a strong Pentecostal background, a mother struggling with mental health issues, and a family tragedy that, over the course of her childhood and growing up, upended Gifty's absolute faith in God. Gifty is now forced to confront all of this when her mother enters into her worst spell with her mental health issues in many, many years. This is a phenomenal novel, and Gifty's story reminds me so much of the faith journeys that many of my guests have shared on this podcast. Speaking of guests, today you'll hear my conversation with Robles, which spans from an incident with biting ants in Puerto Rico to an expansion and weaving together of multiple spiritualities. It's quite a ride, challenging every barrier of faith and gender, so let's get right into this encuentro. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Can you introduce us by giving us your name and pronouns?
Sure. My name is RJ Robles, and my gender pronouns are he, they, them, or ella in Spanish.
Awesome. And what country or countries do you and your family come from?
Puerto Rico, also known as Borinquen, and my people are known as Boricuas. And so I am first generation. I'm living in diaspora, and I am of Afro descendiente, which basically means I identify as Afro-Boricua or Afro-Latinx.
Awesome. And those of us, or those in the audience who are watching the video feed on YouTube can see you are repping with your sweater. What does it say? Can't quite see it clearly.
It says, "This is what Boricua looks like."
Love that. Love that. It's a bit of a running joke. I don't know if anybody else thinks it's funny except for me, but just the sheer number of Puerto Ricans that I've had on this podcast. And I say it's not intentional. I'm Boricua as well. And it just tends to be like, oh yeah, there's another Puerto Rican. There's only been 100 Puerto Ricans on this podcast. So, so what is a good memory that you have of Puerto Rico?
Honestly, the summer times over there. So growing up, I, with my family would try to go every year, if not every other year. And I would spend summers with my grandparents, and most of my extended family who's still on the island to this day. And some of my favorite, most memorable memories would have to be, those summer times we would just like hang out entre familia. We would gather, have like our barbecuing, or like do some carne asada or some lechon and some pernil, and make sure that we were well fed. So abuelita would make sure we had arroz con andule, papa ensalada de papa. She'd make sure we have pasteles. She would make sure we have like all the good food, even if there wasn't necessarily like a holiday or somebody's birthday or somebody's anniversary. It's just like a time for us to gather as a familia. And those memories, one funny memory that I do have of spending my summers on the island. My family is from Lares, Puerto Rico. So that is a very revolutionary place, historical place, but it's a place that's really close to home for me. given that my entire family's from there on both sides. We're from Barrio Piletas, and we're from Lares. And so in Lares, that's known as the like uprising of the Puerto Rican revolutionary movement, the Puerto Rican movement for independence. So I do come from a long line of legacies of folks who've been involved in movement, of folks who have been campesinos, been jibaros, been folk who just like would stand up and like say stuff against the US government. And so one of my favorite kind of hilarious memories was one summer I was there with my family. We were hanging out, and I was like, I must have been like 7 or 10 years old, but I remember like running around the front of the campo of the marquesina, and I got off the marquesina and started running like on the grass on la yarda, the frente of the front, and like I accidentally stepped foot on this like anthill. And, you know, the ants in Puerto Rico are no joke. They will come at you. So it was like really hot. It was, my foot was just like on fire. I immediately yelled, like all the ants were like biting my foot off. And it was just like, it was like having an emergency, like a medical emergency in a campo, which is not ideal because it was going to take a long time for me to get like to the clinic or a local clinic or like the hospital. But yeah, and then I remember my abuelita like coming out with like this rag, and she was just like, toma, ven acá, déjame ver esa pierna, déjame ver. And abuelo just like smacks. He's not even scared. Like abuelo just came with his like palm of the hand and just like started smacking the ants off. And meanwhile, abuela's like with the rag, just like fwa, 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 just cleaning it all off. And, you know, it was just like hilarious. It was hilarious to them and to me afterwards. But in that moment, I was just like, crying, and I was upset, and I was just like, oh no, what did I do? And then my mom was like, sí, eso es lo que te pasa por estar corriendo por ahí.
That is hilarious. And I'm wondering, you know, maybe if Abuela had gotten the chancla, the ants would have they would have dissipated faster.
Right,
you know?
the magical chancla.
Yeah. Yeah, gosh, that reminds me, one of my trips to Puerto Rico, I guess I'm second gen. My mom is where I get my side of it from. And her father, my abuelo, he was in the military. So they were actually kind of moving around a lot. She lived in Panama for a while. She was actually born in the United States because he was stationed there when she was born. So I grew up, I had a lot of family on the island too. I grew up going like just about every year. And I remember on one of the trips, we were in Coamo, we were in El Campo, and we were at somebody's house having a big meal. And I want to call them flying cockroaches. I don't know if that's like the actual like name of what they are. Yeah. I was a little bit traumatized. I was like, I don't know how old I was. Still a little enough kid. And I was already afraid of bees. I'm just not about bees and wasps like in general. And then there we are outside eating, and around the corner of this shed that we're sitting behind, like I'm sitting at the table and I can see this shed. And then around the corner, this giant thing comes buzzing by. It's making a loud noise. It's like fat, and it looks like it has a big stinger. And I was just not about that at all. Yep. And my mom was like,
those are like the cockroaches from El Monte, you know, they're feisty, you know, they like to go after you. Mostly they like leave people alone, but definitely like at nighttime, they like to come out some more and like play. Yeah. Like you'll find them around the like lights. So anybody who like leaves like lights on outside at nighttime, like they'll be like flying around there with all the other like bugs and stuff. So yeah.
Is that your cat?
It is a cat.
Oh my goodness. What is the cat's name?
Simon. I call her Simon. Hi, cat.
So for the audio listeners, this is a black cat. Is she completely
black and white?
Black and white.
Baby.
Oh my gosh, she listened. She just turned her head and looked at the camera. That's adorable. She's very precious. Cats are welcome on the podcast, and as are animal noises and other visits that animal friends may have. So we love to see that here. Um, so this term Latinx,
Mhm.
how is it that you personally experience it or relate to it? Is it something that you embrace? Is it something that you struggle with? Because there's a lot to unpack with it. And so
Yeah.
what is your experience with it?
Yeah, I would say I both embrace it, uplift it, and also wrestle and deeply struggle with it and kind
Mm-hmm.
of disassociate and disidentify with it. So the part of me that identifies with it is my first generation, like being born in the US, being raised in the US, and being labeled as Latino, Latina, Latinx, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part of me that feels like knows how important the term is. Like if anybody calls me Hispanic, I will like slap them because that to me is a very colonizing term.
Mm-hmm.
And for sure like doesn't create space for the hard conversations of being of us as a people identifying with our colonizers, the Spaniards.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't like that term, definitely. That's the least preferred. Um, but Latinx for me comes out of this um before I can even get to Latinx, right? So we have to look at
Mm-hmm.
Latino or Latina, and like
Mm-hmm.
Latino and Latina um really came from like Latin American, like folks who are from Latin America. And oftentimes it got so pronounced in that way that oftentimes the Caribbean was kind of left off. And so folks from the Caribbean, right, those of us who identify as Afro Caribbean, are often kind of left off from the term Latinx or Latino or Latina. Parts of me embrace it because when I was growing up, I remember like in school filling out like standardized tests and being asked like, what is my race? What is my
Mm-hmm.
ethnicity? And if there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't Puerto Rican, then I would identify as Latino or Hispanic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was important to like make sure I was like representing my people. But also it feels like a term that as far as Latino or Latina, I'll get into Latinx in a second, but as
Mm-hmm.
far as Latino or Latina, it feels like a term that's also kind of for me has a lot of vagueness to it. So it's not really clear on like where folks are from. Like outside of the United States, whenever I'm traveling, there's really like this term is like not known outside of the colloquial United States, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
colloquial English.
Mm-hmm.
So like you don't go and like appear in Colombia or Venezuela or Cuba or Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic and be like, I'm Latino, because they're gonna laugh at you or they're gonna be like, what the heck is that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is a US invented, created, westernized term um, to try to describe and include folks who are from 120 plus countries,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's a lot of us who are just kind of thrown into the mix of the same marker, and it doesn't make room for those nuanced conversations. And then I think there's also a way that I've already named that it erases and can reify anti-Blackness within our communities.
Mm-hmm.
So I, at this point in my life, I always kind of wrestled with marking white as my race because that's just not I'm not white,
Mm-hmm.
and I would mark Black, Latinx, Puerto Rican on the like U.S. Census, and you know if there was Afro Caribbean that'd be even better, or Afro Latinx, great.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, for me, it's like both my Boricuaness is both indigenous and Black. It's Black and indigenous, and I cannot separate the two
Mm-hmm.
because I see it in my family. Those are my ancestors. Those are my spirit guides. Those are people who are part of my family's legacy and formation, and folks who have formed me and helped raise me, right? So, like,
Mm-hmm.
my abuela is negra, my mama is negra, and my dad is more of the like light skinned, fair skinned Boricuas. They're both Boricuas, but their skin color are different. And so at this point, like I tell folks, like Boricuas come in any colors and any flavors. And so sometimes it's like hard to pick out who's Boricua. I typically know folks if they're talking in Spanish, like I can tell like, I said Boricua just based off of accents. Or styles or things like that, or mannerisms, or even like inside jokes to the community. And then, you know, really for me, so I embrace like Afro-Boricua, soy Afro-Indígena, of Boricua descent, or soy un Afrodescendente of Boricua descent. I, you know, try to identify in those ways. And then if I have to, more vaguely, Afro-Latinx. Latinx for me, another part of the conversation that's interesting, and this is where my like queerness and transness comes into play, is that Latinx, the X at the end, and sometimes people say Latine with the E at the end, was actually created in community, by community, for community. So what do I mean by that? I mean to say that the whole movement to create a more gender inclusive, non-gendered, feminine or masculine ending to Latino or Latina, right? Like O for masculine, A for feminine, was actually a push by folks in the LGBTQ community, was actually a push led by queer and trans Latinx people themselves. So this was actually a push before it became like so like monetized in the academy, in academia, in academic spaces, in academic institutions, and higher ed spaces. This was actually a term that came from the street where folks were like starting to recognize, hey, I'm non-binary, or hey, I'm a part of the trans community, or hey, I'm gender non-conforming, I'm gender queer, I'm a gender fucker, I'm a gender blender, like bending person. And, you know, when we talk in Spanish, it's such a gender binary colonized language, because Spanish is a colonized language, just like English is. And so when we say things like hermano or hermana, we're actually continuing to erase non-binary people from language itself and from being named as people. And so I tend to say hermanex or hermane when I am speaking of non-binary folks. And so as somebody who identifies within the community as transmasculine, a center of trans experience, but also of non-binary experience, I use the term Latinx, and that's where it makes the most sense for me. Yeah.
That's a fantastic answer. And I always love holding space for people to articulate that type of experience with this term, because on the one hand, it is becoming so much more commonplace in some respects, but that's also bringing so many challenges to the term and so many misunderstandings of where the term comes from, how the term is used. And there is a risk of the meaning of it being cheapened
For sure.
for ease of use. Although, of course, ease of use still is important, because publications and newspapers and book publishers need standard ways of what words they're going to use and all this kind of stuff. So it's definitely important, I think, to continue to highlight everybody's way of entering into what this term does, and to also leave space for those who really do even reject it. I've had people on here that completely reject it, and that's fine. I think that's important to highlight that, especially you mentioned with anti-Blackness, how I've had Black folks come on this podcast and they're like, Latinx that's not my term. And I'm like,
honestly, like, that's how I feel from time to time. Like you know, it's different, right? If we're talking about Afro-Latinidad, that's different versus like if we're just talking about Latinidad. Latinidad continues to uplift whiteness. And we don't talk about that enough as a community, right? As a bilingual community, as a multiracial, biracial community as a community of different generations, right? Of being, whether born back in our home countries or being a first, second, third generations. We don't talk about all these different experiences, even with language, right? Those of us who don't speak Spanish, who just speak English, those of us who maybe speak Spanglish, as I like to call it, like we don't, there's not enough, or even our indigenous languages, right? There's not enough conversations to be had around like Latinidad continues to reify whiteness and white supremacy in such a way that it continues to kind of ostracize Black folks from even within the Latino community. And then for folks on the outside who maybe who don't have that kind of shared Latinx experience or upbringing, it can be very difficult to enter these conversations around race, ethnicity, class, and then you add class, gender, age, ability, disability, and all that, sexuality and religion and all this to the mix, and it becomes very difficult to untangle white supremacy from a lot of these identities. And here's the thing, identity is not static. It's not stagnant. Identities are something we grow into that through a process of becoming. And so we're always becoming as people, as human beings, as flesh, right? As earthlings, as I like to call us. We're always in a process of becoming, of healing, of growing, of transforming. And being transformed is so much of and helping folks transform and be an active part of organizing, being an active role of agitating, educating. That's where my work is at. And so I love to talk about these things and make sure to like connect the dots for folks, because these are often conversations that I'm a part of because I'm in community where folks are having these conversations, and or where we're reacting or responding perhaps through direct actions, through community bail funds, through different interventions to prevent these state-sanctioned forms of violence from continuing to occur and take on as a form of attempted genocide against our people.
Yeah, that's quite a lot to unpack there, and there is what I'm hearing is one of the roots of this is some experience of spirituality. And so I would love to hear about your spirituality and religion, your journey with it, how it's changed over the years, how it's evolved, how it feeds into what it is that you do.
Yeah, so thank you for asking. I have a long experience, long faith journey, spiritual journey, religious journey. For this conversation, the terms that I mostly identify with is spiritual and or faith journey. So those are the terms that I'll be using. So using I statement, right? I can only speak from my experiences. I grew up kind of a mixture of Latino Catholic in the United States for some time. And then my family left the Catholic Church and just stopped going. They started going to like Pentecostal churches. They started going to non-denominational churches, where it was predominantly Black and brown churches. I was raised in Chicago, where at that time, back in the 90s, early thousands, there was just like a lot of gentrification, displacement, economic displacements were occurring. I was raised in Humboldt Park, which is Chicago's Puerto Rican neighborhood. And I remember going down the street, down Division, to La Casa de Capitero at some point, which is like the carpenter's house. It was one of the churches I ended up going to, and just like trying to find my place, but while still feeling very... still feeling like out of place, right? So I was trying to find my place and also feeling very out of place and out of sync with the church. I remember just like the amount of times that I would hear folks being talked about very negatively. It was just like very judgmental Christians, right? So it's very like, it was about anything, but especially like, woo, girl, like if you were pregnant, like at a young age, if you had an abortion, definitely if you were LGBTQ, you were going to hell. You're already in hell. You're an abomination to God, to Christ, to Spirit, to the Holy Spirit. Like, you are like desecrating your body. If you're transgender, you're like your holy temple. Like, I heard like homosexuality is sinful. Like, I got the whole gamut of spiritual, what I like to call and name, and others have as well, spiritual trauma and violence. And so I walked away from my faith for a long time because from Christianity altogether, and started to identify more as agnostic or atheist. And then I fell in love with my first sweetheart, who was kind of my like high school, college sweetheart at the beginning. And I converted to Islam and took my shahada and started practicing for about 2 years as a closeted like person, because the local mosque that we were attending, there was just like no space for LGBTQ folks. They had just created space for Spanish speaking Muslims. And so I was starting to go to those gatherings, to prayers on Friday, and make du'as and just like get more like enriched and included and involved in Islam. And I remember as a Muslimeen, just still wrestling with God, still wrestling through my prayers, through my practices. Just like, I don't know what to do around my like sexuality, my gender. Like, at that point in time, I had been raised as a girl. And so I was embracing womanhood. I was starting to like wear hijab, and I was like, no, there's something about this like still doesn't fit, right? Like, I had known and had dated by that point, like both girls and boys. I had dated like men and women. I had, been out as like bisexual, but there was still something that I couldn't quite like grasp or like put my hands on. And so little did I know, there began my long and extensive transition journey. Before I get to talking about my transition journey, because it relates to my spiritual journey as well, I remember practicing Islam for about 2 years, and then with my partner at the time, and she was queer and Muslim and hijabi and from Jordan, and may her memory be a blessing, peace be upon her, because she passed away. She was murdered. And so after that kind of very traumatic experience in my life took place when I was 20 years old, I decided to, again, just like walk away from faith altogether again. And this time I was walking away from Islam. And obviously due to trauma, lots of trauma there, and grief. But grief will have you do things like that. And so I needed to just like leave and be just kind of spiritual. So I started to identify as spiritual, but not religious. So I was also part of like those millennials who was like, I'm spiritual, not religious anymore. And then I realized in the beginning of college, post her death, that I was actually trans, and I came out as genderqueer, non-binary back in 2010. And so at this point, I've been a part of the trans community for 12 years. And my transition journey has been a deeply spiritual journey. I say spiritual, I say faith-filled, and fulfilling, because that's what it's been for me. I am somebody that was so interested in religion, faith, and spirituality that I ended up studying, minoring in religious studies for undergrad, while I was focusing on a major in gender women studies, and trying to fit the pieces together. And so my senior thesis for undergrad was basically interviewing. I wanted to know what specifically Christian ministers were doing to create spaces for LGBTQ youth within and outside of the church. And so I ended up interviewing about 80 clergy in Chicago who belong to LGBTQ welcoming and affirming churches, congregations, places of worship, synagogues, and mosques who were part of that movement within religious spaces to be open and inclusive and welcoming and affirming. And what I came to find from that experience was that, wait, like I realized I am interested now in this topic through a very like academic kind of lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, what better thing could I do post undergrad than to go to divinity school, go to seminary. Let me go to seminary. Woo! And so I came to Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I moved down south to Nashville, Tennessee, and I relocated, just like uprooted my life in Chicago and my upbringing, and moved down south to the buckle of the Bible Belt and started going to seminary, of all places. And so through working on my Master of Divinity, I became the Carpenter Scholar, which is my focus is in religion, gender, and sexuality. My concentration is in that area. And I started to really wrestle with these topics and these themes and these conversations through theoretical lenses, frameworks, practical frameworks, but also through a theological lens and formation, and started to reckon with what does it mean to be LGBTQ and Christian? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be LGBTQ and a person of faith? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be spiritual? And what does it mean specifically for me to be a QT BIPOC person, a trans person of color, and be somebody who embraces spirituality in such a deep, deep rooted sense? And there's a way that Divinity School allowed me to just like get reconnected to my ancestors, to get reconnected to spirit. And so I also went on this path, and I'm still on the path of Santeria. And so that's where I like started to recall like these experiences in early childhood where I could like hear spirits, where I could just like had these like dreams and these like visions. And I never could like really talk about it with people in my family because they would think I was crazy. Like, what are you talking about? And my family, I didn't come from a family that practiced. It just kind of gave that up in diaspora. And so, but I remember like my tío and tías in Newark and in Jersey who were like definitely santeros. Like, I remember like going there like every other summer and like opening up my like tío's like boveda and like his room. He had like this entire room of just like dedicated to the orishas, and like, but that was like never talked about. It was kind of frowned down upon by like my parents. And so, but I became very curious about it when I was in divinity school. And so that was part of the work that I was doing, was just like deconstructing everything that I was like raised with and trying to construct and transform and live into more of my spiritualities. And I realized that it's spiritualities, not spirituality. Just like for me, it's transmasculinities, you know, it's a plural experience. And so I realized that, okay, I feel this calling. I feel this calling to do more with my life, to give back to people, but to do it in a way that's meaningful, that's life-giving, that's sustaining. And I feel led to help support the spiritual formation of other peoples. And so I ended up, you know, on this like spiritual faith journey walk with my padrino. I got my I'm not crowned, but I'm on the steps towards in Santeria. I got my ocha read. I got my regla de ocha, and you know, I really work with Chango a lot. Chango is my ile, and like I just like, there's ways that that's still a part of who I am as in this body, in this earthling body, in this physical body. But Chango explains so much of who I am spiritually, so wise, at the core, at the root of my soul. And so I do a lot of ancestor veneration and worship. And by the time I ended up graduating from divinity school, I decided to also, I was a part of this like Christian church, Disciples of Christ. And I realized like, wait, there's a way that the disciples of Christ are in Puerto Rico, and they tend to be very homophobic and transphobic on the island. And I was like, well, I want to be a part of Disciples of Christ just to like flip it. So I decided to go then embark on a 2-year journey. So from 2018 to 2020, in 2020, I was ordained as the first open transgender Disciples of Christ minister in the state of Tennessee. And so I still believe I'm the only one. And I have ever since been able to just practice syncretism, pair my Christian values and faith beliefs as a minister, as a pastor, as a reverend, also with my beliefs in the Orishas, my beliefs in spirit ancestors, and my practice in root medicine. So.
That is quite a journey. I do love and I find this to be a trend. Maybe it's partially my own social media circle, and you kind of like finds like, but I just find that so many LGBTQ folks go headlong into the academic side of religion, and that we have so many of us have wherever it is that we ultimately may end up, or where we find ourselves spiritually. I just know so many people that have taken this journey of understanding, well, in my case and many other cases I know of Christianity, but also other religions, not only in a spiritual sense, but in an academic sense. And it's so we can know what we're talking about, in a sense, because there's so much that will come at us to challenge us. We can then have some of the confidence to be like, well, it's not as, things are not as orthodox as it seems. And I know for me personally, some of the joy that I find in my studies is just getting to the weird stuff of Christianity.
Yep.
Like the side wound of Christ. I've just been laughing at that for the past 2 weeks. Laughing at it, but also it's actually really profound. When you sit down and think about it.
The way that I relate to that side wound, we could have a whole tangent conversation about this, is as a wounded healer. Right? So as a wounded healer, I definitely relate to that wounds, because I'm like, yo, that wounds, it might have been the last thing that happened to their body. And we could talk about Jesus' pronouns. That's a whole nother conversation. That would lead me into a sermon, and don't get me started on preaching right now. But that part right there, right? To get hurt in such a way during somebody's what's supposed to be this moment of death and resurrection, and ascendancy and transcendency, right? That, and listen to that word carefully, transcendency.
Yep.
That for me as a wounded healer, it helps explain so much of what is my work in this world, and helping to build the kingdom. Kingdom.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And that is just one of many examples of things that I think you find when you sort of have that academic desire to study faith, because there's some obscure things, and I'm sure this is true of Judaism and Islam and every other faith too, the really obscure things that didn't get into the the Orthodox part that you just can hear about on the streets or whatever. And when you get into or recognize the existence of those types of things, even a lot of the Orthodox stuff just seems less rigid. And it's well, sure, yeah, that's what the vast majority of people in this particular faith tradition, that's what they hold true, but they weren't the only ones. Even when Orthodoxy was everything else is heretical, those other things still cropped up and existed and all of that. And that leads me into you were talking about your syncretism and how you work with that. And so I'm wondering, because I'm sure that you've been challenged many times on that, and particularly in Christian spaces. Syncretism is one of those things that, like, I would say a good majority of Christians would be like, that's a heresy. So I'm curious as to how it is that you've navigated those conversations, and maybe some of the theology that you have around how you've reconciled that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say in response to that is, number one, first and foremost, don't attack somebody else's cultures and traditions unless you have any sort of level of proximity. And even if you're in proximity to it, you're not the person who is practicing. You're not the person who is a part of that community. So if you're an outsider to the community, I really don't think you have a voice or a say, right? As somebody who is a practitioner, spiritual practitioner, it's important for me to name that people who are outside of Santeria don't understand, regardless of if they're Christian or not, whatever religious or spiritual identity, don't understand that this is a community of believers. It takes a lot of faith. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of dedication. It takes a lot of practice. And I mean, like, practice, like day in, day out, like rituals. It takes a lot of courage and bravery to be in relation to a padrino. It takes a lot of vulnerability to open up along the steps of the way of the spiritual walk and journey, to literally, like, have your heart on your sleeve, because you're being read spiritually, right, by others. You're being led into kind of communion with the ancestors and spirit guides. And I'm being led by, like, my guardian angel. I'm being led by my, like, family's ancestors. I'm being led by just the ones that I fucks with, right? Because there are some that you should not be messing with out here. And we need to know the difference. We need to be better at, like, knowing the difference, that there are some ancestors who just didn't do their work of healing. And those are not the ones we need to be messing with or uplifting, right? There's also ancestors that some of us uplift, even within the community of Santeria, that have continued to replicate white supremacy. And that's a whole nother conversation to have as well, around how white supremacy and cis heteronormativity can show up in Santeria communities. And that's very real, because it took me such a long time to find a house where I could be in communion with other Santeros and other godchildren, and, like, my siblings, my sisters and my brothers, and realize that this is a space for me, right? Like, as a queer person, as a trans person, this is also a place for me. And because there's so many houses out there that are so, like, deeply, not to talk shit about anybody, right? But just to name that it's a fact that there are some, I'll put it that way, there are some communities within this world that are very led by the cisheads, are very led by and driven by cisgender people, by heterosexual people, and that are intentional or inclusive of queer and trans folks. And that's been a part of the work that within the community we have been trying to raise awareness of and raise consciousness of. So just to let you in on some of the conversations that have been ongoing, and that this work is not just my work. There have been folks that have come before me that I have to give credit to them for having paved the way so that I could be here today, right? Like, I don't just have a seat at the table because I made a seat. It's because other people made and carved that way for me. Right. And so I always have to give credit to being in conversation with my elders. And for me, my elders include my Taino elders, Taino T, but it also includes my Afro elders, my elders who are Afro-Indigenous, my elders who are my Babalaos, my elders who are my trans elders, who have just made the way for me to even exist, right? Like, my existence is resistance. Who said that? Jenny Gutierrez said that, an amazing trans woman, Latina, that I just want to uplift her work anytime I have the possibility to uplift, because she gave me that theological lens. What I see as theological, my existence is resistance. That is theological. That is a theological claim, right? Mi existir es resistir. That is a theological and a spiritual claim that is rooted in community. And so I just wanted to like name that and uplift that and share that and reflect back on some of that, what I've learned in movement and in being in community. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I love, I always enjoy just being witness to the way that trans folks in particular experience and also embody their spirituality. Whether it's somebody who has many spiritualities like yourself, or other trans folks that I know who are more or less more squarely in a Christian space, or in more of a singular religion. There is just something about trans theology in particular that has so much life and richness to offer. And just just going into drawing from my Christian context, like the very basic way that I see it is like, okay, so we have this term Imago Dei, and we say that God created man and woman, that God is neither man or woman, and then I think that in all of what as human beings we can witness within creation is a little bit of what the reality of God is like. Not that we always see the full picture, but just a little bit. And so what is somebody's transition journey then a witness to maybe not the complete full picture of how God is gender, but just it's a way, it's an experience and a journey that God provides, walks some people through, and then for those of us who don't go through it, we can bear witness to that, and we can see just a little taste from seeing that experience of, okay, this is one small aspect of what God is like. And we should be amazed, just as like a cisgender person like that. I think about that like a lot with various just transgender people that I've known. Some I've seen pre-transition through their their transition journey, and I just think about, and then it just like, and so I think about that, and I'm like, and I think about people who want to continue to be transphobic and want to continue to hold transphobic theology, and I'm like, wow, you're really denying yourself the ability to witness an aspect of what God is like. A very specific way of what God is like, and it's just like,
here's what a lot of folks don't want to hear. Trans folks are divine. Trans folks are sacred. Trans folks are beautiful. Trans folks are literally like Imago Dei, like in all the sense of that word. Of that phrase. And when we look at scripture, right, I'm going to get a little preachy here, but when you look at scripture, because you referenced it in your definition of Imago Dei, and for those of you who don't know, Imago Dei is the image of God, made in the image of God. So the original text is in Hebrew, and the original before that was in Aramaic. So now it's being translated to like English, and then hundreds of years of translations, we get what we got in the Bible, right? And that there's still so many different interpretations, that there are still so many different biblical scholars, Hebrew scholars, who are doing the work of actively interpreting the words in English, right? So we're still getting at roots. So all this is like still being argued in that world. But nonetheless, to go back to image of God, Imago Dei, scripture says in the beginning, right, Genesis, the creation story. There are two creation stories. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of Christians I've spoken to do not know that. And as a minister, it is my job, especially as a trans minister, it is my duty to let folks know, like, do you realize that there are two creation stories, two creation narratives in the Bible? And what does that mean, right? Which one do you like kind of appease to more often? And more often than not, you hear like Adam and Eve. That is the creation story. That is that a lot of these homophobic and transphobic Christians kind of lead in with. But they dismiss the first one. And the first one is simple. God creates like the water, separates it from the mountains. God creates the animals, separates it, blah, 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 blah. Day and night, blah, 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 right? The 7 days of creation, or the 6 days, and the seventh is rest and Sabbath. And then God creates humans. It says God creates humans. And this is where Imago Dei comes from, because it's in God's image. And what a lot of people don't realize is the original text, it's not Adam. We're not talking about Adam from the second chapter. We're talking about Adama. And Adama in Hebrew means earthling, creature, means human being. So I do believe it is my faith, it is my theological belief here that through the work of trans theology that I'm able to understand the first human being as trans. As trans celestial, as trans spiritual. I'm able to understand that human being as an embodiment of all of humans and its diversity and its multiplicities. And so that's something that I see, and I have to do the work. We have to do the work, the hermeneutical work of coming at the scripture with what a lot of scholars and theologians call, and people of faith call, hermeneutic of suspicion. So please always, I have to encourage folks who are listening to this podcast later to just come at scripture with an open mind, but also this hermeneutic of suspicion. Like, question. It is okay to question. It is okay to interrogate. It is okay to deconstruct your own faith, right? If you're learning here something new today about what we've been talking about, that's great. Take something and do your homework, do your research. Don't just talk to like your pastor at this one church you've been going to your entire life. No, get outside of that community. Talk to others. Fellowship, right? God says where there's one, there's two, there's me, right? Like, go fellowship with people. Be amongst the people and talk with people who are different from you, who look different from you, who identify different from you, who have a different background than you do. Because that's the beauty, right? God created differences for a reason. I don't think it's out of inconvenience for us. I think it's actually to help us heal. It's actually to help us embrace differences and to embrace each other along the process that is so-called this life. And so that's what I would say. You also reminded me to go back to something earlier, that this journey of syncretism and this journey of being trans is a rite of passage. It's my rite of passage, so no one gets to take that away from me. I get to claim my rite of passage, and I get to reclaim my time. And I get to do that in this lifetime, and I do believe that goes in alignment and is in complete alignment, divine alignment with trans liberation now.
Very, very well said. And so with this now, what is this work that you're doing now? What are some of the efforts, the organizing, the different things that you're doing that folks can know about?
Yeah, I am currently, so my work lies in the intersections of healing justice, spiritual coaching, formation, and social work and ministry. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but it's basically, I'm a movement chaplain. I am a minister by training, vocation, and I'm also a social worker. So I currently, my work is with with one nonprofit agency and with a hospital. So I work locally for a hospital, for a children's hospital that, as a mental health specialist. So I provide mental health support to children who are anywhere from the ages of 6 to the ages of 18, who are at the hospital seeking access to mental health care and treatment. And so I provide that support to them when they're like getting checked in, when they're spending days at the hospital. I just continue to provide that support there. The other role that I have is as a family support specialist. So one of my roles with this nonprofit agency that I work at is to provide support for unaccompanied minors and their sponsor families. So I'm working within unaccompanied minors and within the Office of Refugee and Resettlement to make sure that minors who crossed the border, who came unaccompanied, can be reunified with sponsor families and have a safe place to call home and to be raised. And so in all of that work, and that's my paid work, I do some side contract work as well. So I'm a healing justice coach for independent contractor where I do healing justice coaching for trans youth of color through an organization called the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network in Cutin. And so in Cutin is a healing justice organization that is Black-led and started by Erica Woodland. And Erica and I have been working together for the last couple years along with an organization, a nonprofit called the GSA Network. And so I work with the council there of young trans folks who really need that additional support, especially during the times of COVID, to really check in month-to-month basis where they can access me as their healing coach. And I hold sessions with them. I do rituals with them. I hold space for them and just do that emotional, deep, like shadow work. So that's what excites me. I also serve the church in 2 roles officially. So I am on the council. It's a 4-year appointment for something called the Disciples LGBTQ Alliance, also known as Disciples Alliance Q. We are a council, kind of like think of it as a nonprofit organization within the denomination of Disciples of Christ. So we represent LGBTQ Disciples of Christ folks within the church. And so I am currently in my 2nd year of that council. And from there, I do things like virtual puppet supply, which means I do virtual preaching gigs. I provide pastoral care support to different congregations across the United States. I'm in community and supporting the launch of the first Latinx LGBTQ welcoming and inclusive Disciples of Christ congregation in the United States. So there's different parts of my work that I do there. And this is just all volunteer. This is what makes up my ministry. And then I also, within the United Church of Christ denomination, the diocese in alignment or in partnership with the UCC. So with the United Church of Christ, I currently sit on the Encuentros Latino Advisory Committee Council. So I provide feedback there and support for Latinx religious leadership. So that is an amount, the totality of my work and what it looks like right now. It's basically in the fields of healing justice, mental health, pastoral care, and ministry.
Wonderful. And is there any social media accounts that people can follow you at?
For sure. So I always love to give folks my Instagram page. Feel free to follow me on Instagram. It's Boy Rican Joy, and boy as in BOI, Rican Joy. That is my my name on Instagram. You can also follow me on Facebook, RJ Robles. But yeah, I am a proud Afro-Indigenous Boricua trans boy, mental health specialist, a healing coach, spiritista, minister, and here at your service. And so if you have any questions after listening to this podcast, feel free to reach out. And I would love to remain in conversation with you. I'm hoping to at some point launch my website and kind of get my own coaching gigs going from there. But until then, you can find me on Instagram.
Wonderful. And now this is maybe going to be a little bit of a loaded question, but just to wrap things up with final reflections, what to you would it really look like for churches or other religious communities to really be inclusive of Latinx folks? What does that look like in your opinion?
For me, we get oftentimes so caught up and stuck in this conversation about inclusivity. I don't just want to be included, because for me, inclusivity is oftentimes an afterthought. Like, oh, I've already got this congregation. I've already got this group of followers or people, lay people. And now all of a sudden, boop, I thought about Latinx people. No, like, I don't want to be your afterthought. If you're already in that process at that point where I am your afterthought, we are your afterthought, then you've got some serious questions and things to wrestle with, right? Before you can even reach out to folks in the community. To my advice, 2 cents, real quick advice for folks who are in that position right now, is to then reach out to Latinx ministers first before you reach out to Latinx people in your community, right? Reach out to Latinx ministers first so that they can be your conversation partners and can also be, if they have the time and space and also receive coins to do so, can be your consultation partners, can be your accountability partners, can be your conversation partners. If you're at a point where you're thinking about, okay, well, I do have some people of color, I do have some Latinx people here, but we don't really know how to like include them as far as like the different programming or areas of worship or ministries that we're trying to like do, or like I can't get the folks to like attend certain events from the church or stuff like that. I would say be intentional about how you market these events, right? So like be intentional. Things like day and time will matter a lot, right? You're talking about Latinx people, like we're busy working, we're busy like with our families, we're busy going out, we're busy living our lives. And so I would say just like be mindful of the days that are important for the community and how you want to show up for the community, right? Like it's not just important to show up for like Latinx History Month, which I believe every congregation should know when is Latinx History Month and also Black History Month. But folks should know like Trans Day Visibility. Folks should know, which we just celebrated. Folks should know Trans Day of Remembrance. Folks should know these conversations need to be intersectional. Right. So it's not just about one identity over another. It's about, you know, at the end of the day, because if I were to come to your church or your religious community or spiritual community, I can't split my identities up. Like I'm not going to choose my like transness over my Afro-Latinidad. I'm not going to choose my Boricuaness over my queerness. Like I'm going to this is a full package, honey. It's a full package. So what you're going to get is a full package. And so I need you to think about the full package of folks who are in your communities or folks that you're trying to do that outreach to.
Fantastic. We will wrap it up there. You gave us so much food for thought. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and sharing your insights.
Ashe, thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks so much for listening to today's show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this. On behalf of Encuentros Latinx, we hope you'll join us on our next Encuentro.